Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911, Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and we are back with another innovator interview. You know, humanity faces serious and difficult questions as it adapts to climate change and its weather and temperature extremes, rising sea levels, and the impact on food production and the livability of currently populated regions. The Atlas of Disappearing Places is a new book by our guest, Christina Conklin, and her co-author, Marina Psaros. It's a catalog of the locations around the world most at risk during the climate crisis, but it's also a forecast about how humanity, including all of us individuals, governments, and business, can collaborate to restore the planet. It explores the consequences of the changing chemistries in our ecosystems, the strengthening of storms, warming water, and ice loss, as well as all the consequences of rising seas along coasts around the world. The Atlas of Disappearing Places was published by the New Press and is available in a beautiful hardcover edition on Amazon and at booksellers. It's really worth reading in paper because it is a beautiful book. A previous guest on the show, John Englander, who's the author of Moving to Higher Ground, Rising Sea Level and the Path Forward, said of the Atlas of Disappearing Places that it grasped the depth and breadth of change taking place. Creative, informative, and provocative, it presents us with artful surprises, poignant anecdotes, and memorable facts. I highly recommend it. So we've heard the blurb from the cover. Let's meet the author. Welcome, Christina. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, hey, the book really is. It's just a pleasure to read and to look at, largely because of your artwork. What inspired you to create an atlas of all these locations threatened by climate change, and how did you and Marina decide on these stories in particular?
Well, we wanted to take a very accessible storytelling approach to contrast with some of the scientific papers and reports that are coming out that are very hard to digest. We wanted something very approachable. So we decided to pair a climate change impact in the ocean with a particular place, and that way we could cover different parts of the world and also all of the major impacts that are going on. We really just did a journalistic search of where were the interesting stories, what were we most interested in. We each wrote about half the chapters and focused, were the leads on those. And it was, each one was a sort of a passion project. We really loved the research on these stories.
Well, it's also, your artwork is a compelling part of almost every page of the book. Tell us about your background. How did you start thinking about turning maps and information into art?
Yes, well, I've always loved maps. I think many people do, and I have a history as a textile artist, and I've always used unusual materials. And I started gathering seaweed along the shore near my home, and then I got an art residency in the far north in the Arctic in Svalbard, and they had seaweed there too. And I think it was so surprising to me how pervasive in the ocean algae is, and it married well with the story of change in the oceans, to use a product of the ocean to illustrate the problems in the ocean. And so I began drying and drawing on the seaweed with inks. And then I digitally layer the seaweed image, which is a sort of a translucent, looks a little bit like tissue paper when it's dry. It's very ethereal and beautiful. And then layer that with a digital map, a satellite map, and it looks sort of like the seaweed is enveloping the earth. And that is appealing to me too.
So it really is lovely. That was one of the things that kept me turning the pages. The stories are great too. Now, your approach to the oceans, really to all life on the planet, is holistic. You treat them as a body in crisis. And the question I wanted to ask as I was reading is, should we think of ourselves as part of that body? We tend to think of nature as something else, but we're really all part of this bigger thing that is literally dying. How should we be addressing our relationship with the earth?
That was ultimately my reason for writing the book, was to propose or remind people that we are nature, we are part of nature. This is an interconnected planet. It worries me that we have, for a few hundred years now, felt quite separate from and above and masters of nature. That's a story that is actually fairly recent in human culture if you go back through time. And as an artist and a a cultural observer. I look at indigenous stories. I look at other worldviews, and I see that this is that this has put us on the wrong path. So what would it be a story that would put us on the right path? And that would be a story of we are all one system. We are interconnected within the natural world, and if we begin to really understand these relationships and reintegrate ourselves into the natural system, we'll make better choices about sea level rise. We can't continue to just build walls against the ocean. We need to learn to cooperate with and work with the system that we are part of.
So let's talk about some of the stories. And in the very first story in the book, you talk about the Montreal Protocol and how chlorofluorocarbons and other pollutants are changing the chemistry of the seas. In the 1980s, chlorofluorocarbons, I always have trouble with that word, were banned by the Montreal Protocol. And more recently, hydrofluorocarbons were added as well. Now, you portray a future in which we can be hopeful. What should we be learning from the efficacy of the Montreal Protocol when thinking about preventing further acidification of the sea?
Well, I would actually broaden from ocean acidification to climate change overall is what we need to be preventing. And we need to be preventing that by scaling back fossil fuel use to near zero, right? That is the only thing that's going to put the planet back into balance.
Do we need a UN protocol that bans petrochemicals?
That would be ideal. Yes. I mean, not immediately and not in a way that would, cause harm and distress to people who need cooking oil and people who, need heat and electricity. Like, we have to do this change rapidly without, causing great distress. And so but what the Montreal Protocol showed is that there was a lot of fear that was going to, hurt industry and change things. But what the international community realized that was a planet-threatening problem, the ozone layer. I mean, I think maybe that was not clear to the average person on the street, but it really, in the geophysics of planetary life, that was a big deal. And so the leaders really saw that and took the nettle by the hand and did what needed to be done. And we are in the exact same situation now. We're a little late to the game on realizing how serious the climate crisis is. I think part of what we tell in the book is, some of these impacts take decades to sort of play out, especially in the ocean. There's a long delay because it takes a long time for the ocean to heat up, but then it also takes an equally much, much longer time actually for it to cool down again. So we're at a critical point, and what we really need to do is wean ourselves of our addiction to fossil fuels. You were mentioning the ocean as body metaphor that we use in the book to draw analogies, and we really are. Every part of the world and every part of our lives is really hooked on fossil fuels right now, and that is the single thing that is going to continue the planetary warming that is causing all these critical changes.
And the oceans, of course, absorb more of that heat than any other part of the ecosystem. And that is part of what contributes to the bleaching of corals and so forth. How long do you anticipate, and I know this is a speculative question, it will take for us to get the oceans, not just the atmosphere, to start to cool down? Are we looking at centuries?
Sadly, yes. So the amount of carbon we have in the atmosphere right now is more than we've had in 3 to 4 million years. Mm-hmm. And if we can create, dramatic changes in this century to decrease carbon from its current levels in the 420-ish level back down to a pre-industrial level, change that trajectory downward rather than upward. The safe zone for life is in the 280 to 300 category range. And until we do that, things will continue to warm because there is more carbon in the atmosphere than homeostasis, than like a stable planet wants. So at least the way we've known the planet so far, the planet can get much, much, much hotter and has in the past. But in terms of the range of temperatures and comfort and sea level and all of those things that are familiar to us, that is where the incentive should be to really get control and bring carbon levels down.
So you also in each chapter look ahead. And in one of your future scenarios, which you refer to as describing the plastic century lasting until 2050, you describe the emergence in the 2020s, so this decade, of recycling and regeneration laws, as well as bans on plastic and oil-based products. So how do you develop your projections? Are you looking at the trends you already see around us? And my main question is, why do you have confidence that humanity will develop the will to actually act on this?
Well, it can be hard some days to feel optimistic, but I am an optimist, and I wrote the book really to learn about and understand the ocean, but also to see all of the hopeful things and meet some of the people who are working their tails off to get this right. And our political leaders are often getting it wrong. They're slow and late to the game. This hopefully will be, led from the bottom up. This change. I think I've seen a huge change in the past 4 years since I started this book in awareness, in enthusiasm. I don't think change is linear, both in the climate change way, it's ramping up rapidly, but also in the cultural sphere. I feel that change can be nonlinear, there can be tipping points, right? They can be dramatically toward the positive. So I wanted to highlight those sorts of stories. And so I do have hope. I think the alternative is unthinkable. And so in terms of the plastic century, that is a very hopeful scenario that public awareness of the damage plastics cause in the oceans and elsewhere increases so dramatically that we just change the materials we are willing to buy. We stop wearing plastic clothing. We stop using plastic junk. I mean, there's a few things we need that are useful, bike helmets, etc. But we can radically reduce our plastics use. And there's also interesting means of plastics recycling at a very high level, not the sort of recycling we do now. So, this, and there are material scientists working on this. There are environmental groups working on this. I think, so part of it is learning about the problem and being part of the solution as an individual. I mean, because plastics come from fossil fuels just the way synthetic clothing does, just the way oil gas for our cars do.
So you really do have confidence that consumers can get involved in this. What do you suggest? And I know that this is woven through the book, but how do you recommend they express their concern about this in order to actually accomplish change? A lot of the scenarios describe that as an undercurrent that led to regulation. But how can they make a change just by influencing a company? Do you think we need more outbound communication to brands saying, "Hey, just stop it"?
Yeah, and I've done that in my life. I was tired of Trader Joe's plastic clamshells, and I said I won't be shopping with you anymore until this changes a lot. And it did get better for a little while, and then it got worse. So I think we do have a huge role to play. The fossil fuel industry, just one thing I learned that was very shocking. They plan to replace all of the petrochemicals that are currently in. If we switch to electric cars, and a lot of people are doing that, they plan to make up for all of that and much more in plastics consumption.
Yeah. So
if we realize that we are being, lied to and played, for suckers, then we can make different choices. And it is very, it is almost impossible now to go to the grocery store and not end up with a cart full of plastic. But we need to just be very conscientious, make better choices, go to our farmers market, reuse our plastic bags. And this is not to say that we can write the whole new story, but we have such an important role to play, both as as models for younger people and as individual consumers right now. And yeah, write your representatives, write to the companies and let them know.
So let's take this down to where you live, the San Francisco Bay Area, which has been extensively re-engineered over the past 100 years, and particularly polluted by the high-tech industry. Another modern convenience that has a lot of consequences we haven't fully acknowledged. Pregnant women are advised not to eat fish caught in the bay because of the toxic runoff. That's just one of many issues in the Bay Area. What changes do you expect to see around the Bay as society starts to think critically about the race to automate that began in the mid 20th century? Are we going to see some reeling in, or do you think that they're going to try to transform themselves a little like you just described the plastics industry, taking up all of the oil consumption from fuel to make up for it? Can tech be a good solution, and how would that change the Bay Area? And I know you did projections about this, so I'd love to hear that.
Well, I'm also hopeful that the tech industry would wake up. This is all about waking up, right? Waking up to the fact that we are part of a natural system, that we cannot engineer our way out of this entirely. We have to look for nature-based solutions, collaborating with the natural world. So sea level is going to rise in the Bay Area. That's going to expose a lot of our past chemical and landfill dumps to, water and corrosion and it's going to be a toxic soup for quite a while. Remediation is something we will need to invest in. Every city has this problem. Every city has built infill into their watersheds, right. And 20 of the world's largest cities are on estuaries, and so as sea levels come, you just can't build a wall around everywhere, and so we have this very complex set of problems. In the Bay Area, for instance, they are restoring a lot of the natural salt marshes. Mm-hmm. And that is a good solution because it naturally filters the water. It provides some flood protection. But still, if sea levels are going to rise 6 feet this century, that's not going to be enough. So we need to be thinking in these staged and also very long-term ways, rather than my local county is still permitting building right in the flood zone, and they're building these, high-tech campuses everywhere, and it's just silly. They want the tax revenue, but it's just a disaster in the making.
Short-termism,
yes,
of the worst sort. Now, so let's just kind of run through a few of the facts you covered, because it's the kind of wake-up call that I think will get all people to take some time to spend with the book. How much land do you see vanishing, for instance, in Asia over the next century?
Yes, Asia is going to be hit extremely hard, especially coastal China. Mm-hmm. One of the chapters in the book is on Shanghai, which is in this very low-lying river plain of the Yangtze Delta. And 150 million people live in this flood zone. And, and China is banking on building this into, now it's a city of 25 million. They're planning to double that by 2050. But 2050 is when sea level rise really, really ramps up. And so all of coastal China is going to have to radically reform itself. And what the story I tell about the future in that chapter is about, people moving inland to eco cities that are built to a higher standard of, they use green concrete rather than the polluting kind. And, so there are possibilities, but there's also just going to be a lot of disaster, especially and then another chapter is on Vietnam and the flooding of rice production around Asia, and the peasant farmers who will struggle and suffer enormously. And of course, then comes climate migration and refugees. So so many of these issues are piled on top of each other into a very complex web that we're going to need some international cooperation and intelligence on in advance of the crisis.
So you just described a situation where 150 million people, 40% of the U.S. population, may be displaced. How many people do you imagine globally are going to be on the move as a result of climate change by 2100?
Well, the United Nations predicts 248 million, I believe, So when that's happening and where and how, that's of course has to do largely with disasters, and
Sure.
the disasters will become more frequent and more severe. And one of the chapters was about the Rohingya in Myanmar, because that's talked about as ethnic cleansing, and it was a genocide, but it was exacerbated. One of the factors was climate change, and that we've heard about that in Sudan and Chad and Syria in terms of drought. But in terms of sea level rise of the ocean, storms are getting worse. The farmland, the coastal farmlands are getting salinated, which means the soil is far less productive.
Which can happen before the actual flooding.
Absolutely. It does happen before. And so it can be a result of the flood, or it can be this gradual process. So the idea of climate migration is sometimes a critical event. And sometimes it's just this gradual attrition of like, this place isn't habitable anymore. I can't survive. And so people will be on the move all over the world. They already are. And there are some very interesting things happening around this, something called the Global Compact on Migration, again, happening at the United Nations level, which is to redefine migration, to hopefully provide some funding and regional solutions so that we don't have these human tides of people just suffering everywhere. And so I have some hope on that. There's some forward-thinking people who are working on it. It won't be perfect, but we do have to think ahead about this issue as well.
So you do have an idea about how to move forward. There's a course of treatment that leads to a word from one of my favorite philosophers, Bruno Latour, to transilience, which means jump ahead. Those are those breakpoints, those disruptive moments when a tipping point occurs. What do we need to do to start that motion? And particularly, what can our listeners do when they follow up reading the Atlas of Disappearing Places? Where should they begin to drive that adaptation on their part in their community in order to start this grassroots movement?
Right. Transilience is interesting. It's a word from geology that means, if you look at layers of rock and there's an abrupt jump, and that shows a big change, a radical change in just sort of overnight in geological terms. And that is, a term, I think, that can be very useful in terms of, what do we do now? Mm-hmm. Well, we need to take all the funding that we use to subsidize fossil fuel industry and use it to subsidize regenerative agriculture instead. I mean, that amount of money could be really transformative. And we're looking for transformative change right now. So part of that happens at the bigger political level, but there are also local and regional levels. A lot of the best climate change work is happening in cities,
right?
And so we do have more influence locally, and we can use that influence. It's maybe not exciting to go to public planning meetings, but it can be very influential to show up and be the loud voice that advocates for good land use decisions, whether that means dense urban housing next to public transportation, or maybe in a rural area, it's about protecting agricultural land for local agriculture rather than sprawl. So it's about learning about where you are and also learning about the things you use and the things you buy and making some conscientious choices. So I think it's both about raising your voice and watching, how you spend, and also then thinking about what is your creative gift, right? I had the opportunity to write a book, and that was pretty great. But, everybody's got a gift. And so it could be, hosting block parties to learn about these things, or starting a book club, or, writing articles for your local paper. What is a way to learn something and then contribute something to the movement? And because there are tipping points, and they've shown in studies that it really takes a relatively small number of people in society to change the tide on an issue, which is very, very hopeful. Again, that if they say it's as low as 3 to 5% of people, if we really commit to this new narrative, these new stories, a new way of living, and I'm seeing it happening all over the place, that we can change the story, that we can turn the tide, and there will still be climate impacts rolling out throughout the century. It will be hard, actually. I for my children and their children, there are some difficult years ahead as I think of it as threading the needle of the climate crisis. Like, we've made a mess, and we are going to have to come to terms with that. And the other thing is to just really look it solidly in the eye and not turn away anymore, right? We need to really wake up.
Well, I think you just described the map that your book provides. And I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us about it, because it really is a useful tool, not only to become informed and inspired, but to start to think about how to act. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you so much for having me.
We've been talking with Christina Conklin. She's the co-author of the new book, The Atlas of Disappearing Places. She and Marina Psaros are the authors. Check it out and take some time to really dig into the stories and look at the representations of how our planet is changing, because it will inspire you and it'll get you moving. This is Earth911, Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. We hope you'll share the show with your friends and family. Let's get people talking about these ideas. Let's get people aware of the opportunity to make a difference in this world. We'll be back with another episode soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. We'll be back soon. Have a green day.